preliminary findings after the present. We will make sure that you have one-on-one with Ms. Douhan after the briefing. Please let me know. We will make that possible. With that note, Ms. Douhan, the floor is yours, Madam.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm presenting today my preliminary findings on the visit to the Republic of Zimbabwe as the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. These observations, which I'm presenting today, are of preliminary character and are the result of the extensive consultations with a wide range of interlocutors. The full report will be presented at the session of the UN Human Rights Council in September 2022. During the visit, I met the President of Zimbabwe, the Speaker of Parliament, the Chief Justice, and the government of the Reserve Bank, and the whole cabinet. I also met the UN country team, members of various political parties, independent civil society organizations, women's rights activists, and human rights defenders, as well as faith-based organizations, trade unions, businesses, small and medium enterprises, employers and bank associations, members of diplomatic community, medical personnel, university professors, independent researchers, and school teachers. I also had the opportunity to visit Bulawayo and met its provincial minister, as well as representatives of the private sector, the health sector, the school and higher education sector, as well as representatives of political parties. I also conducted visits to the National Railway of Zimbabwe and Bus Corporation of Zimbabwe. I extend my gratitude to all these interlocutors who have generously offered their time, information, analysis, experience, and thoughts to help my understanding in a very short time what has proved to be a very complex and structured dialogue. Although I had the opportunity to meet many representatives of independent civil society organizations and human rights defenders, I note with regret that a substantial number of NGOs and some other interlocutors failed to engage with the mandate due to the various hateful and intimidating messages that appeared in social media and news outlets, and an alleged fear of losing their foreign donations. I reiterate my invitation to all interlocutors to share their views and experience on the impact of unilateral sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights in Zimbabwe ahead of the final report. I commend the warm welcome and the constructive and cooperative way in which the government facilitated my visit, which enabled a frank and open dialogue. I express particular thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for its efficient engagement with my office. I also thank the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office for its support throughout the visit. I will meet the part about the contextual background on the application of sanctions. You will find it in the statement which is published on the web page of the mandate and which is published together with a press release. And the full statement will also be shared with you by the UN country team. As we all know, the humanitarian situation in Zimbabwe, as well as the situation in the economic sphere, is very much alarming. A number of issues in the sphere of health, education, environment, economy, industry are rather scared. I will come, however, to the problem of the investment, to the assessment of the legal basis for imposition of sanctions, and it was the main concern of the presentation and my report. I stress that under international law, unilateral measures without or beyond authorization of the UN Security Council may only be taken when they comply with states' international legal obligations, that's called retortions, or in the course of countermeasures in accordance with the rules of law of international responsibility. That means they are supposed to be applied against states for violations of international legal norms with the purpose to restore the fulfillment of international obligations. They are to be proportional to the breach happened and to be necessary and shouldn't violate fundamental human rights. Unilateral sanctions imposed against natural and legal persons in Zimbabwe, as well as secondary sanctions and extensive overcompliance by banks and third country companies, raise serious concerns about their correspondence with international legal standards. In particular, while recognizing that states may freely vote at international organizations in line with their foreign policies, I note that instructions of ZDERA to the US Executive Director at the international financial institutions to oppose extending any loan, credit, or guarantee to the government of Zimbabwe, or to cancel or reduce debts owed to the government of Zimbabwe to the United States or any international financial institution unless the President certifies otherwise, do not correspond to the purposes of Article 1, paragraphs 2 to 4 of the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund. In particular, to promote international monetary cooperation, to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, and to contribute thereby to the promotion and maintenance of higher levels of employment and real impact, and to the development of the producer sources of all members as primary objectives of economic policy, to promote exchange stability, and to maintain orderly exchange arrangements among members. This approach turns ad hoc decisions into nearly automatic denials, especially in view of the US possibility to block the IMF decisions. I consider that the state of national emergency announced by the US government on 7 March 2003 in Executive Order 13288 as the ground for introducing sanctions against Zimbabwe and repeatedly extended doesn't correspond to the requirements of Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, such as the existence of the threat to the life of the nation, the limiting of measures to the exigencies of the situation, a limited duration, and the absence of discrimination, as referred to in the communication of human rights experts of 29 January 2021. I'm concerned that existing unilateral targeted sanctions as a punitive action violate, at the very least, obligations arising from universal and regional human rights instruments, many of which have a peremptory character. In particular, procedural guarantees and presumption of innocence, with a view that the grounds for their introductions do not constitute, for the most part, international crimes or comply with the grounds for universal criminal jurisdiction. The designation of family members of listed individuals contradict the prohibition of punishment for activity which does not constitute a criminal offense and constitutes collective punishment prohibited by international human rights law. I underline that the listing of the majority of higher state officials as the possibility to designate property or companies that they own or control affect nearly all economic sectors. Imposing higher fines on companies and banks for dealing with designated individuals or property they control based on payments in the US dollars results in increasing reputational risks and the adoption of zero-risk policies by the US and third country nationals and companies as a part of over-compliance. I remind that targeted sanctions cannot in practice be isolated from the negative consequences on Zimbabweans of secondary sanctions, civil and criminal penalties for circumvention of sanctions regime, zero-risk policies, and over-compliance. The cumulative effect of those is an important factor undermining the capacity of the government of Zimbabwe to exercise its duty to maintain the functioning of critical infrastructure, to achieve sustainable development goals, and to ensure the enjoyment of fundamental human rights. I underline that applying extraterritorial jurisdiction to nationals and companies of third countries for cooperation with Zimbabwe's public authorities, nationals, and companies, and the alleged threat to such third state parties is not justified under international law and increases the risks of over-compliance with sanctions. I remind on the inadmissibility of applying sanctions extraterritorially on the basis of using payments in US dollars on the ground of expanding jurisdiction. I'll pay some attention to the impact of unilateral sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights. Due to the lengthy period of imposition of unilateral sanctions, it's complicated to identify the exact impact on the situation in the country, as it's affected by the vast number of elements. Unilateral sanctions, secondary sanctions, and over-compliance in their complexity have exacerbated the pre-existing economic and humanitarian crisis, inhibiting the building of essential infrastructure and international and interinstitutional cooperation necessary for the achievement of sustainable development goals. The designation of senior state officials, as well as companies owned or controlled by them, makes foreign companies and banks unwilling to do business with Zimbabwe's public sector, preventing the government from getting revenue for the exercise of its public functions and provision of essential services, resulting in the violation of labor and social rights of people involved in the public sector, whose salaries are reported to be much lower than in the private sphere. This has led to rising unemployment, especially among the most qualified professionals, like engineers, doctors, teachers, university professors, judges, and police officers, which at times is reported to reach 30 to 50%. It has also prevented the government from using resources to develop and maintain essential infrastructure, disaster response plans, and for social support programs, which has a devastating effect on the whole population of Zimbabwe, especially those in extreme poverty, women, youth, children, medical workers, and people with disabilities or life-threatening or chronic diseases, particularly in rural areas. It is reported that credit lines are periodically opened and humanitarian assistance provided for meeting urgent humanitarian concerns like HIV, cholera, or COVID-19, however much less for developmental projects. The stated readiness to impose secondary sanctions and criminal and civil penalties against natural and legal persons circumventing unilateral sanctions regime and the imposition of higher fines on Zimbabwean banks like SBZ, Standard Chartered Bank Zimbabwe, Barclays Bank, have resulted in Zimbabwe being qualified as a higher-risk country, the adoption of zero-risk policies, and the departure of 87 correspondent banks from Zimbabwe. Overcompliance by third-country banks and private companies has resulted in growing problems to transfer or receive money when natural or legal persons of Zimbabwe are participants in the transactions, including freezes of money in Zimbabweans' bank accounts, closing long-established bank accounts reportedly in the US, UK, and Switzerland, extending the lengths and costs of bank transfers, and the need to do transactions via third-country nationals. Unilateral sanctions against natural and legal persons of Zimbabwe, in conjunction with secondary sanctions, zero-risk policies, and overcompliance, are exacerbating the economic and humanitarian crisis, forcing the government of Zimbabwe, banks, public institutions, private companies, and individuals to look for alternative ways to participate in international trade. By involving third parties, using alternative, informal, non-transparent mechanisms of trade and payments, thus aiding to corruption rather than suppressing it. Preventing the participation of Zimbabwe and its people in international cooperation, aiding to the isolation of country, impeding Zimbabwe's achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and undermining the right to development of the people of Zimbabwe. Preventing Zimbabwe from participating in international cooperation by impeding its ability to pay membership fees for international organizations or have interparliamentary cooperation isolate Zimbabwe from international cooperation and prevent the fulfillment of the right to development. I note with concern that due to the unavailability of new machinery and spare parts, the immigration of competent staff, and the unavailability of financial resources for medical expenses, the people of Zimbabwe have limited access to public transportation, electricity, water, and health care, affecting, besides economic and social rights, the right to the health and to life, especially in the course of pandemic. These same reasons impede access to safe drinking water and sanitation, resulting in the increasing risks of cholera, COVID-19, and other diseases. The negative impact of unilateral sanctions is exacerbated multiple times by the de-risking policy of banks, donors, and trade and cooperation partners, resulting in overcompliance, reportedly impeding the possibility of citizens of Zimbabwe and private businesses to participate in international cooperation and professional or sport trainings and exchanges, affecting thus the right to education and the possibility of professional growth. By preventing the flow of investment to Zimbabwe because of higher reputational risks, the number of working places is negatively affecting, resulting in external migration and involvement in the informal economy. I'm concerned that the use of extraterritorial secondary sanctions and reported fear of sanctions result in overcompliance with existing sanctions regimes, preventing the government of Zimbabwe, its public sector and private companies from purchasing machinery, spare parts, medicine, food, agricultural supplies, and other essential goods, and also result in a growing number of bank transfer refusals and difficulties for transfers that can occur, resulting in rising prices for all, especially imported goods. Insufficient resources, the limited availability of technical aid, and delays in building essential infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, transport, electricity, agriculture, courts, and recruitment of qualified professionals, result in the unavailability of medical aid, food insecurity and poverty, affecting the quality of work of public institutions and resulting in the violation of terms and quality of public services, including investigations and court hearings giving rise to crime and corruption, and affecting therefore the right to health, to education, to due process guarantees, and many other. I note with concern that the lack of resources, limited access to development loans, the reluctance of foreign entities to deal with Zimbabwean partners or invest in the economy makes it hard and expensive to buy necessary medical and technological equipment, reagents and spare parts for the repair and maintenance of water, public transport, telephone and communications systems, schools, hospitals, houses, and other public services, and to implement developmental projects, including those approved by UNIDO and other organizations, thus undermining the enjoyment of many human rights, including the right to a decent life. Low salaries, unemployment, and growing involvement in the informal economy result in migration to neighboring countries, rising poverty, involvement in criminal activities, corruption, prostitution, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and drug abuse, especially among the most vulnerable, including women, youth, and children. I note that poverty, insufficient resources, the use of third country partners and banks, often in non-transparent procedures, which is also due to the impact of unilateral sanctions, fear of secondary sanctions and de-risking policies, as well as the unavailability of technical assistance for institution building, traditionally give rise to crimes and corruption, and undermine the institutions and values of democracy, ethical values and justice. It jeopardizes sustainable development and the rule of law, as defined in the preamble and Article 9, Paragraph 1 of the UN Convention Against Corruption of 2003. I underline that low salaries and reduced internet access result in the impossibility to pay tuition fees and growing school and university dropout rates. The immigration of teachers and university professors and the reduction of numbers of schooling hours, endangering thus the exercise of the right to education. The reported reluctance of foreign partners to cooperate with Zimbabwean educational institutions, sports societies, and private companies, as well as impediments to money transfers, difficulties in getting visas, the reported uneligibility or limited eligibility of Zimbabwean students and scholars to research grants and scholarships, affect the right to education as well as international academic, sport, and cultural cooperation, innovations, academic freedoms, and cultural rights. The impossibility to buy equipment, raw materials, and spare parts directly from producers and the impediments to bank transfers prevent the involvement of Zimbabwean companies of all sizes, including those organized by or for vulnerable population groups, like, for example, people with disabilities or women in rural areas involved in folk crafts, and agriculture and the mining industry in international cooperation, and results in substantial declines in their revenues, leading to poverty, the violation of the right to food, health, life, and economic and social rights. The same reasons have been reported to create a substantial 6 months or sometimes 2 years backlog in manufacturing IDs and passports, affecting therefore the right to the recognition of the personality, which limits access to the rights to education, to work, to social guarantees, and to the health care. Besides that, the unavailability of credit and foreign investment, overcompliance by banks, higher costs and longer duration of bank transfers, impediments in the delivery of essential equipment and spare parts, and underdeveloped and deteriorating infrastructure affect tourism and prevent the implementation of environmental protection and sustainable development projects. They also result in rising immigration from Zimbabwe, primarily of males and qualified youth. Now it's up to 5 million, affecting rights of the workers as well as of those women and children left without stable incomes. I move now to my recommendations. I remind all parties of their obligation under the UN Charter to observe principles and norms of international law, including the principles of sovereign equality, political independence, non-intervention in the domestic affairs of states, and peaceful settlement of international disputes. I welcome the decisions of the European Union and Switzerland to minimize the number of active targeted sanctions to zero, and calls on the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia to review and lift sanctions on natural and legal persons of Zimbabwe in accordance with the principles of norms of international law and human rights law. I urge all stakeholders at the international and national levels to stop using the rhetoric of sanctions as an advocacy tool and to engage in structural dialogue to settle any disputes in accordance with the rule of law. I stress that sustainable development goals can only be achieved in the spirit of solidarity and cooperation between countries. I remind that any unilateral measures may only be taken where they duly comply with states' international legal obligations or are applied in the course of internationally lawful countermeasures. I also remind that no good intention justifies the violation of fundamental human rights as a collateral damage. I urge all interlocutors, including states, international organizations, banks, private companies, and civil society, to avoid coercion, written or oral threats, or any other act which may cause or result in overcompliance, and to interpret all limitations in the narrowest possible way in the interim period before the lifting of unilateral sanctions, with due account on the guidance issued by the Special Rapporteur in December 2020. I urge the US government to seize the state of national emergency regarding Zimbabwe that is not in accordance with the norms of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and to bring national legislation in accordance with the international law, including human rights law, refugee law, and law of international responsibility. I call on banks and private companies to behave in accordance with the guiding principles on business and human rights, to avoid overcompliance and the consequent violation of rights of nationals and residents of Zimbabwe. I also remind on the obligation of all states and regional organizations to comply with the principle of due diligence and to take all necessary measures to guarantee that activity under their jurisdiction and control won't affect the human rights of people in the country and beyond national borders. While welcoming certain legislative and organizational steps taken to suppress corruption, I call on the government of Zimbabwe to implement systematically its program to achieve that objective, enabling the effective functioning of the Anti-Corruption Commission and the system of anti-corruption courts, and proceeding with complex and verifiable investigations. I amplify the fact that unilateral sanctions introduced allegedly to minimize corruption in practice result in its growth because of the impossibility to do direct bank transfers, involvement of third parties, and the use of informal and non-transparent schemes. While welcoming humanitarian support provided to Zimbabwe by donor states, I remind on the need for pro bono involvement of all interlocutors, governmental, non-governmental, and international, to rebuild Zimbabwe's capacity to restore essential infrastructure and public services, to enable the government to implement its duty to take all necessary means to achieve the sustainable development goals on elimination of poverty and hunger in the sphere of health, nutrition, labor, social guarantees, education, access to internet, and elimination of corruption. While recognizing the devastating consolidated effect of unilateral sanctions and overcompliance on the right to development of the Zimbabwean people, and also on the right to food, to health, to education, and labor rights, I call on the government of Zimbabwe, in cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN country team, to implement fully the cooperation agreement signed between them and to organize visits of relevant special procedures to the country. I call on the UN agencies and organizations, in cooperation with relevant humanitarian organizations, to organize monitoring of the negative humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions within their respective spheres of interest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Douhan. You've heard her preliminary findings. The floor is open for questions. Please let me know.